Shrouded by the heinous impact that former dictator Benito Mussolini had on Italy and Europe before and during World War II is the story of how, after the 1943 armistice, tens of thousands of Italian army troops previously fighting under the fascist government command eventually took up arms as part of the Allied armies fighting on the Gothic Line in the last year of the conflict. While the reformed Italian army's contribution after the Italian armistice was initially more symbolic, its role did in the last months of World War II play a strategic role in securing the post-World War II peace in Italy and in helping the country become a founding member in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and what is today the European Union. To tell us more about this important but little-known World War II chapter, my guest today is retired Lieutenant General Antonio Ligobi, and he has a distinguished career with more than 4 decades in active service, including United Nations and NATO deployments in Israel, Syria, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Afghanistan. Since retiring from active service, he, among other things, serves as director of the Center for Studies and Historical Research at the National Association of Veterans of the Italian Co-Belligerent Armed Forces. And his interest in this historic period is also linked to his family background, as both his father and uncle were awarded the Gold Medal for Gallantry, which is the highest Italian military decoration, for their activity during the resistance against Nazi Germans in Italian-occupied territory. Antonio, welcome to the podcast, where we explore the Gothic Line story that took place more than 81 years ago and the lesson and links it has with today's precarious European geopolitics and security situation. Now, Antonio, when Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was deposed after 20 years in office and was arrested in July of 1943, that triggered a cataclysmic turn of events. One of the first was the September 1943 Italian Armistice, when Italy withdrew its declaration of war against Allied countries and joined them as so-called co-belligerents. Before Mussolini's arrest, there was approximately 2.5 million soldiers in the Italian fascist army, most of them conscripts. Before I ask you about the choice, or scelta, as it is known in Italian, that the Italian soldiers faced, I would like to ask you if there was already dissent or even rebellious plots within the ranks of the Italian army before Mussolini was arrested and the armistice was declared.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, first of all. And a few points, if I may. 25th of July change in government was not that cataclysmatic. The problems came on the 8th of September. I would say that actually the replacement of Mussolini went quite smooth. Mussolini lost the support from the fascist party on the 9th, between the 24th and the 25th of July, and had to resign. When he presented himself to the king, he was then arrested. But nothing really occurred on that situation. Italy continued to combat on the alongside with the Germans. There were no real problems triggered by that event. There were no real protests against Mussolini's arrest, and not even the fascist militia took action against that. The armed forces were great part loyal to the monarchy, to the Kingdom of Italy. And that's shown by the fact that already in 1923, the fascist party felt the need to build its own militia, its own fascist armed forces alongside the royal armed forces, and built up the Milizia Nazionale, la Milizia Volontaria di Sicurezza Nazionale, That was a fascist organization, faithful to the party and not to the king. And there was, in fact, opposition between the regular armed forces and the militia. So that went smooth. You said there were already signs of miscontent.
If there was any attempts, for example, to assassinate, like what happened with Hitler, like there were several attempts.
Obviously, the war was not felt as our own war by many Italians. The alliance with Germany was not felt really as natural with our own history. And it was clear that since the end of 1942, so there was signs of discontent among the people and mainly among the military. There was a plan to take away Mussolini by the military, but that didn't actually take place because it was preceded by the old fascist party. At that point, there were plans to do it, but it actually did not take place because the fascist party was even faster in taking me over. I would say that some events were critical, not only the ongoing campaign in Africa. We lost all the empire in both Eastern and Northern Africa, but the main keys were the disastrous conduct of the Russian campaign with the disasters there, and the landing with Operation Husky in Sicily, and the starting of the bombings on the capital. I will say that the bombing on the 6th of July in Rome, in the area of San Lorenzo, that had a terrible effect on the public. The royal family went to see what had happened. Mussolini didn't, because obviously he probably felt what would have been the reaction of people. The real cataclysm came later on the 8th of September. It was made known that we had signed the armistice. Things had not been prepared. They've not been prepared because both the king and Badoglio, that took the government, were very afraid of the German reactions, and so they were reluctant to elaborate detailed plans for our units on what to do. In the meantime, Germans did, contrary to the Italians, had prepared themselves. The Germans took this situation in order to justify the presence of further strong reinforcement, like the Goering SS division that was sent to Sicily, and the structure of command in occupied territories, and I'm looking at the Balkans, Yugoslavia, Greece, and Albania, and in France, was all mixed up so that there weren't anymore a direct line of command of the Italian units and of the German units.
Now, before we go on, I just would like to give our listeners a few points of reference with regards to your explanation on that question. Now, the July 16th, 1944 bombing of Rome that Antonio referred to was carried out by the U.S. Air Force and not the Germans. And it was a targeted raid against rail yards and steelworks in Rome that helped support the German occupation of Italy. However, there was a collateral damage as errant bombs hit an apartment building not far from Vatican City in Rome that tragically killed approximately 1,500 Italian civilians. Also, another point of reference I should explain to listeners is that Operation Husky that Antonio just mentioned was the code name for the American and British Allied forces' amphibious landing on the island of Sicily in July of 1944. And those troops had departed on ships from the coast of northern Africa, where they had recently defeated in the desert German armies led by German General Erwin Rommel. And finally, the landings in Sicily preceded the landing of Allied troops on the Italian mainland south of Napoli in September of 1944. Now, After Mussolini was arrested, he was put in prison in the high mountains of Abruzzo, east of Rome, and then was rescued by the Germans and taken to Lago di Garda in northern Italy to serve as the head of the Nazi puppet regime called the Italian Social Republic. So, did any of the Italian military assist the Germans in rescuing Mussolini?
No, it was a pure German special operations. They were very well planned, well conducted by the Germans, but the Italians didn't even expect something like that. From the 25th of July to the 8th of September, there was no attempt by Italian fascists to liberate Mussolini. And there was a small garrison of Carabinieri who had no possibility to respond to the German special operation to liberate them.
So, when it comes to the actual choice that the soldiers had, was there actually a choice? Was that something up to each individual?
Well, it's a little bit complex. So it depends very much from where somebody was and the situation in which he was operating. And apart from his current belief, let's say that for units that were in Italy, and in Italy at that time, there were roughly 24 divisions, but of those 24 divisions were divisions that came back from Russia and had suffered tremendous losses and were being reconstructed. So for the soldiers in Italy, actually, there were three choices: fight against the Germans when the Germans came to try to disarm them. Because let's go back a moment and to the Badoglio Declaration on the 8th of September. Badoglio was the chief of the government uh, after Mussolini. Badoglio was a former general that had been also chief of staff defense until prior to the Greek campaign. He was also operated in Africa and conquered Ethiopia. He went on in opposition to Mussolini when the Greek campaign started because he was against it. He considered the Italian forces was not prepared to do it, and he was then chosen by the king to replace Mussolini when Mussolini was arrested.
Just going back, you said the soldiers had three choices.
Yes. So the three choices when the Germans tried to disarm them had the choice to accept to be disarmed and taken prisoners, fight against the Germans, or run away and try to go on. This as far as the units that were in Italy. For the units that were outside Italy or were on ships, etc. Let's say that the choices were just two. There was one, either you accept to be arrested or you fight against the Germans. Obviously, there was not the possibility to go back home in those situations if they were, for instance, in Greece or in Yugoslavia.
So, amongst the soldiers themselves, was there any violence, for example, between those who wanted to remain loyal to Mussolini and those who didn't?
The issue of being loyal to Mussolini did not exist on the 8th and 9th of September. The issue was fighting against the Germans or accepting to be arrested by the Germans. There wasn't at that stage an issue of the fascist party. Mussolini was still in prison, and the Italian Social Republic was established only 2 weeks later, on the 23rd of September. The real problem occurred mainly abroad, and especially in the Balkans, because we had something like 35 divisions, 600,000 men between Greece, Yugoslavia, and Albania. Do we fight, or are we in a conditions to fight against Germans that want to disarm us, or we are not in a conditions to fight because there was a superiority of forces by Germans? So that was the real issue. Accepting to fight or in a situation where you were in a minority and you are weaker, or accepting to be arrested. Issue also of accepting to join or not the social republic is something that came in later, at a later stage. And in fact, we had some cases where everybody took part to the resistance, where it was clear. Let's say the defense of Rome. Defense of Rome, all the units had no doubt in what they had to do, and even if the king and the government had gone away for 2 days, all units resisted to the Germans in Rome, and they were supported by the local population. One interesting thing is that in the defense of Rome, these political formations built up by the fascist party fought with the Italians, and I'm referring to what remained of the Milizia Nazionale, the Sicurezza Nazionale, and the Italian African police fought along the Italians against the Germans. The only case, very strong case that I know about, was the one that occurred in Sardinia within the paratroopers division. One battalion decided to continue to fight with the Germans. When the chief of staff of the division went to talk to them, to convince them to follow the orders of the division and to fight against the Germans, he was killed. Colonel Becky Luzerne, by the way, was an hero of the Battle of El Alamein. But that was the only really significant case. And those battalion of paratroopers then fought alongside the Germans in the defense of Rome in 1944.
So within Italy itself, were there geographical divisions, like in the south, maybe were they leaning towards remaining allied to the Germans or not? Or in the north, like in the mountain divisions, that I understand it, some of them actually remained loyal to Mussolini?
No, not really. Obviously, in the south, there was the fact that the Allies were in the south. It was much easier for units and part of the south was under both Allied and Italian control. The capital had moved on the 9th of September to Brindisi. The court and the government had moved to Brindisi. Puglia was in great part under Italian and Allied control. On the other side, what happened was in other parts of Italy, there was an attempt to disarm, as I said before, units. And that was planned by the Germans already from March 1943. Obviously, the Germans took control of great parts of Italy. So many Italian soldiers were arrested and taken to then campi di concentramento, to the lagers, where they're then asked to some if they wanted to go back to Italy and join the Army of the Republic. The military unit that disbanded, mainly in the mountains, originated the first partisan units. And let's say somebody that is not pro-military, Luigi Longo, communist. He was the number 2 of the Corpo di Volontari della Libertà. He later was the Secretary General of the Italian Communist Party, wrote about the 8th of September in his book. There were soldiers going to the mountains. They were going to the mountains carrying their weapons, guided by their officers and with a sense of discipline. So it was recognized the first instance of the resistance were mainly small military units disbanded. Then the situation started to change in the winter 1943, 1944, and the partisan formation took also a different organization, more politically driven, etc. As far as the forces of the Social Republic, well, there were the regular forces of the Social Republic built up by General Graziani, who was one of the few high-ranking officers who joined the Social Republic, but he has been set out from any important position already in 1941 because of his conduct in Africa. He built the regular forces, which were mainly based on new conscription. There were a lot of other forces, the Guardia Nazionale Repubblicana, which where they had the former Milizia Volontaria di Sicurezza Nazionale they joined in, and they had a lot of voluntary militias.
Just for our listeners, you're speaking of the troops that remained loyal to Mussolini now, just so they understand that.
And so, well, the loyalty was of the army was to the king, the Kingdom of Italy, to the new government that was not fascist, and so there was no remaining loyalty to Mussolini. The Republic, they were established completely for new, or with people that had been taken to concentration camp and accepted to join the enemy forces, which after the 8th of September, 1 million Italian soldiers had been taken prisoners by the Germans and disarmed. Some escaped soon, but between 650 and 700 remained in concentration camps and never accepted to join the Repubblica Sociale forces. And of this, between 40 and 50,000 died in concentration camp for refusing.
That's a very important point. Also, well, as I understand it, many hundreds of thousands were actually taken to prisoner camps in Germany. Is that correct?
Yes, that's where they were taken. The Operation Axet took them in Germany, and that was where actually almost 700,000 refused to join the Mussolini army. They got someone who joined, but was a minority. And by the way, some of those that had joined, they were organized in 4 divisions, trained in Germany, but when they came to Italy, then they had a lot of desertion programs.
So now, what about within the different armed forces divisions? So, example, the Navy, Army, or the Air Force. Was there differences amongst those factions?
Yes, definitely. Well, but the context is different. Okay, let's go one step back. Mussolini and the Fascist Party did not trust the armed forces. That's also why they built up the Milizia Volontaria di Sicurezza Nazionale. They distrusted mainly the army and the navy. They trusted much more the Air Force because they felt the Air Force has a fascist service, a little bit because of the linkage with the futurismo, flying, things like that. So in the Navy, in 1919, 1920, the general staff was also very much concerned of officers who had shown ideas near to the fascist party, and so they were controlled. So this is something that needs to be taken into account. Obviously, in the Navy, forces that were on the ship, there was little to say. The Navy reacted almost all, taking and going to the south. Some ships have sink themselves, not to be captured, but the majority of the ships went to the south to be handed over to the Allies. There were some units, minor units, that left and joined the Social Republic, but were a minority. On the ship, obviously, there was little choice to be done. If the ship went to the south, even if someone was maybe not very much in favor, it was already there. There were, however, other issues by the Navy because the Navy had at that time also detachment outside Italy. Some of them joined the Germans and some refused to join the Germans and were arrested. And the situation was even worse, but it was minor numbers because the Navy had detachment in Japan because Japan was an ally, and those were almost all in majority arrested and kept in prison. Only a few of those sailors were in support of joining the Japanese forces. The Air Force is mainly in Italy, and what happened in the Air Force was that great part of the flying units were concerned followed the decision of the commander. So there were some units that went north, like the one whose commander was one of the axes of the war, Adriano Visconti, and some units that went south. For instance, the one by Graziani, the Nepo of General Graziani. He took an airplane, escaped, and went to the south and joined the south to say how the situation was. There were different views in the same family. For the army, the situation was much more difficult, and it was because for the units that were brought, they had to consider what was the possibility to either to fight the Germans if they were in conditions to fight and not to be disarmed, considering as, for instance, in Cephalonia, they tried to fight back the Germans and they were annihilated, massacred. There were units that joined the partisans in the Balkans, other units that gave up.
That was Italian retired Lieutenant General Antonio Ligobi speaking and explaining the complex situation that Italian soldiers faced in 1943 when the country declared an armistice with Allied forces. Also, that was just part one of our discussion. We will resume part two, where we cover similar issues and expand into the dangerous geopolitical situation that Europe faces today.